We're here today with Barbara Denny, Paal and Ginny Strazisar Travers. And we're talking about their role in the three-network transmission in 1977, and also in interneting in and around that historic event. So, do you want to just start with Jenny, talking about when did your involvement start with this?
My involvement started in April of '75 when I came to BBN, and I pretty quickly got involved in doing the work on the gateways, which were the machines that connected the networks. That was really what became the internet, was the ability to connect multiple networks. We had an experimental network called the Resource Computer Network at BBN, and we had a gateway there between that and the ARPANET. And then I installed gateways between the ARPANET and the Packet Radio Net, and between the ARPANET and the Atlantic Satellite Network.
Jenny, this is the voice you hear off camera is Vince Cerf. When you were doing the work on the gateway, Bob Kahn remembers that gateway code was in the station originally, and then somehow migrated out. When you got to BBN, were you working on a completely distinct device that was acting as a gateway?
Yeah, for the gateways between different networks were generally done in a completely separate device and was a PDP-11. But for the Packet Radio Network, we combined the packet radio station code and the gateway code into a single PDP-11. So that was the distinction, but the other gateways, the ones between the satellite network and the ARPANET, were always separate PDP-11s. So they communicated on one side with, like, the ARPANET, and another side with the satellite network, and directed the packets between the two networks.
But wasn't one of the original design, at least the original idea, to have a combined SATNet and SATNet node and a gateway? But then BBN decided to split.
That could have been the case. I mean, even within BBN, there was one group of people who were doing things like the IMPs and the TIPs and the satellite IMPs. And there was another group of people, of which I was one, that was doing, the Internet Protocol work and the TCP work and the gateway work. Mm-hmm. So I can believe that there would have been a split there.
Well, in fact, it's Vin again. My recollection is that before Bob Kahn insisted on separating the satellite network from the interior of the ARPANET, there was a very strong preference on in one part of BBN to integrate everything together into one common set of devices. But that would hide all of the interfaces, in effect. And the only thing you'd ever see would be the external interface of what, in effect, is the ARPANET. And Bob wanted very much to have an externalized and open interface that other people could build to. That's where Internet is different. And so I could easily see the tension there, but in the end, the people who were paying for the project got to decide what the architecture was.
I mean, I very distinctly remember it as being separate because I did the software and somebody else was doing the hardware end of it. And so we were trying to coordinate these trips so that, like, for example, we got the PDP-11 installed in London in December of '76, and then I came and did the software. And then what happened when I went to Oslo was I think there was a TCP/IP meeting there, and then they were supposed to install the hardware, and then I was supposed to install the software. And I think that there was some glitch somewhere along the way with the hardware, because I ended up staying with you for a few days, and then I went off and toured Norway, and then I came back and installed the software. So I have fond memories of visiting with Paal.
And to give a little bit of your background, you were just out of college when you took the job then?
I went to Case Western Reserve and I graduated with a bachelor's degree in '74, and then I went to work for MITRE for 10 months. So in that job I had a little bit of exposure to the network world, but it really sort of kicked in gear when I came into BBN in April of '75. The thing was that Case was one of the first, not one of the first, but one of the early nodes on the ARPANET, so that by the time I got to BBN, I already knew people like, Jerry Birchfield or Ray Tomlinson or that sort of, if nothing else, from all of the reports in that, because we were running a 10x system on the ARPANET at Case.
So, and you went around the world installing these gateways in which period? That was 76.
I started, let's see, the best of my recollection, I installed the work here probably in the summer of 76. Installed the one in London in December of 76. Installed the one in Norway in, it would have been the summer of 77. So that would have paved the way for the three-way demonstration in the fall of 77. And then that was the last of them that I installed. I think that subsequently there were gateways that went into Italy and Germany, but I became involved in other projects, and so those were the ones that I had a part in.
And so, Paul, tell a little bit about when Ginny arrived, what was going on in your institution, and how did she come to stay with you?
Maybe I should give a little background on myself first. I'm educated as a nuclear physicist and did my PhD in experimental nuclear physics in Holland. I started to work for NDRE in early 74. No, sorry, 72. And then after a few years, I was asked to join the internet, or you can say the computer communication project, which NDRE would like to participate in. And so that was my sort of starting with computer communications, without any background at all. I've just seen a computer. I hadn't done any programming, except a little Fortran modifications to a program I was using to analyze nuclear physics experiments. So it was a very hard time to catch up with all these ingenious guys, and but I found the group which we worked with very stimulating. I mean, it was sort of kicking my back the whole time to try to be in synchrony with the rest of the group. Okay, I think that's sufficient for my background. Then in end of 74, I was asked to join this the packet switching project, and started to work full time from the beginning of 75. But then that was partly on catching up with TCP/IP, and next to participate in the packet switch satellite network development. So I had to devote time to both of these, and fortunately I was in London in October 75 for 2 months, and overlooked the initial TCP/IP test between Stanford University and University College in London. They had 2 separate implementations, but I think they had a little smaller difficulties in getting TCP to establish a connection. And one problem I remember was that Stanford had a different way of calculating the checksum than UCL. So in the beginning, all the packets were just thrown away because the checksum didn't fit. But that was easily solved, and then they were able to establish a connection. So that was wonderful to witness.
Paul, I'm wondering, it's Vint again. My recollection of some of this is like yours, that the checksum calculations weren't always the same, implemented the same way. When John Postel was doing bake-offs, where we would get, a dozen different implementations all trying to talk to each other, we first started by turning off the checksums to see
Yeah.
how many could actually communicate. Then we turned on the checksums, and all but two of them didn't talk to each other anymore.
Yeah.
So we asked the two guys who could communicate exactly what algorithm they had used, and whatever it was, we adopted it, so everybody else had the same thing. My recollection of those tests with UC London is that we were getting a grand total of 2 or 3 packets per second out of the TCP.
Oh, that could be.
So it was a fairly placid kind of exchange.
Well, you have to remember the line. Well, maybe they have a separate satellite connection at that time between UCL and Gunhilly and ETEM. But I can't remember the capacity of that leased line.
It was 9.6
9.6
kilobit line
Probably.
going from Keller down to UC London over
No, but
satellite.
that was a little later.
Sorry?
That was a little later. They had a leased line from UCL through Gunhilly to ETEM and then into the ARPANET. That
That was a 48 kilobit line. There were two lines. There was a circuit that went up to
Okay.
Norway at 9.6, and there was a 48 kilobit line that went to Goonhilly Downs.
Sure.
And I remember at the time that was considered blazingly fast for British Telecom to supply. But before we had the satellite connection, and we were just doing the TCP testing in 1975,
then
we didn't have the SatNet was not part of that test. It was going through a satellite link that was internal to the ARPANET.
to the ARPANET, yeah, sure.
Down to Tonham and into, or wherever it landed, to Keller, and then the landline at 9.6 down to UCL. So that data rate was fairly modest during that time frame. I have a question about the three network test, Jenny.
Yeah.
Even though you had installed gateways, I think at all 3 of the satellite downlink sites at ETAM, at Goonhilly Downs, and at Keller, my recollection of the 3 network test is that the only gateways that were actually used for that test were the ones at ETAM and the ones, or connecting to ETAM, and the ones at Goonhilly. I don't think any traffic exited into Norway. Do you remember? Because the packets never actually left the.
I think the point was like to
landed
show it
anywhere.
going all the way through everything and sort of coming back. So it was like some kind of a round trip. And like you said last night, we may have engineered the packet algorithms and routing algorithms in the gateways in order to achieve it.
I'm
But-
pretty sure that it was engineered to run through
Sure.
only 2 gateways, because if it had to go through 3 gateways, then it would have had another satellite up and down hop, and I don't think we did that.
I mean, the other thing is that this experiment was one of a whole slew of experiments that we were doing. Somebody asked last night, like, well, did you keep the whole thing up? Well, we kept it up as much as we could.
Yeah.
I mean, the packet radio network was different in the sense that that was like only up and running when they were out running around with the van and they had all the radios powered up. But the ARPANET Atlantic Satellite Network, that was supposed to be providing real connectivity for people to be working on it.
Right.
So we tried to keep that part up as much as possible.
Yes. I guess
Barbara,
I'll start with
do
a
you
little
wanna-
background about myself.
Perfect.
I was like Jenny, I just had a bachelor's degree. BBN was my first full-time job. I went to Carnegie Mellon, but I had exposure to the ARPANET at that point in time, and actually it was instrumental in some ways me going to BBN. I had an account on CMUA, and I wanted to keep it. So that was one of my criteria for looking for a job. Who am I talking to that has the network? And of course I talked to BBN. They came on campus, and I went up there. And then I started working on packet radio in the fall of '81. But at that point, I had to use the tip to still go back to CMU, because the packet radio net and our test bed really wasn't connected all the time. And so if I wanted to send email to my friends, I'd have to go back to the tip and access CMUA and send it as BD0N, was my username. So that was a lot
What
of
was
fun.
your responsibility at BB&N and the packet radio program?
Okay, yeah. Well, I worked for Joe Westcott and Mike Beeler, and Charlie Lynn were part of that group at that point. And I was responsible for making the packet radio protocols work at that point in time. One of the first papers I got was Jenny's How to Build a Gateway. It was in there, but it never caused me any problems. So I was like, okay. And they had just were making the transition from the single station control of the packet radio net for the multi-station. So I got Greg Lauer's code and just running experiments and dealing with SRI and supporting it. And at that point, they had started, I believe, the test beds in Fort Bragg. And so one of my jobs was to make sure we kept the test bed users happy, because we really, as you know, wanted to get the military excited about the technology.
Exactly.
And so actually a lot of times I would call SRI, because at those days BBN only had a small set of radios. And if I wanted to do any more complicated experiments, SRI had a more extensive test bed. And I'd call them and say, please configure the net this way. I want to run the experiment. We had the cross-net debugger that would allow me to work at BBN and run stuff and dump the information I would need from all the different tables and try to figure out what was going wrong or what was going right and fix things when I found them.
You know, I haven't heard the term cross-net debugger in a long time.
Yeah, it was really
That was a very important
XNET.
tool.
Yes,
Let
it
you
was.
decide what was 3,000 miles away to find out what it was doing.
Yeah, so that's a lot of what I did on my first project at when packet radio was still the first infancy, and then the subsequent work I went to SRI and continued on with packet radio, and by that point the routers really were separating out, and I worked on the LSI 11 router for the Constitution protocols.
Did we actually, I don't recall that we ever called them routers. I think we
No,
still
they
called
were
them
always gateways, right?
It didn't turn into a router until Cisco Systems started calling them that.
Yeah, my recollection is, it was originally the gateway, and then what happened, it might have been Cisco. I also heard like application things we're calling transformation gateways, and we're going, wait, here's a gateway. Which gateway are we really talking about? And so at that point, there was a transition from being known as a gateway to a router. But to be honest, I don't remember exactly when that flop occurred, but it definitely was a change in terminology.
And when did you go to SRI?
I started SRI in '83.
83.
But yeah, at that point, I was working on a router in Ada for the.
Good Lord.
Yeah, it was popular, and actually that was my program when I was at CMU. I was working with the grad student department and developing a software development environment for Ada. So I already had the Ada skills, so I got asked to try to develop one of the first router in Ada. So we spent some time doing that. And the technical problem they were looking about is how to do emission control. Unfortunately, that project was, due to a funding cut, we never got to finish the implementation of the planned technology to try to handle emission control, which is when you cannot, you can only receive, you cannot transmit, and so how to make that all work with the TCP/IP protocol suite.
This was a big issue because the Navy was particularly concerned about ships at sea, submarines especially, not being exposed
Right.
by radiating, because they might be detected by satellites. And so when you're in MCON, that meant you didn't radiate at all. But that made it really hard to make TCP work, because there's this thing called ACKing, and it can't acknowledge the receipt of the traffic. So you have to assume that it got it, or you have to transmit multiple times. I often wondered whether we got anything to work in that domain, because if we did, it was after I left ARPA. So.
Oh, yeah, no, unfortunately, like I said, our funding got cut because there was a transition in the Navy department, and they decided they didn't want an Ada gateway anymore, or that problem, and so we never really got to finish the technology underneath it. But a subsequent fun one, which unfortunately was not till the mid-'80s, if you'd like to know about, was the reconstitution protocols, and that's when we tried to do a mobile IP scenario and use the aircraft to connect.
That was like 19, and I remember
It
that
started-
test was 82. Does
Yeah,
that
it
sound
started,
right to
and
you?
the experiments went all the way through until like '86. I was just talking to Jenny, things stick out in your mind for me was the fact that I was in Omaha for an experiment, and then the disaster with this shuttle happened, and I was like, oh my God, as I'm sitting at the terminal trying to get things to work at Omaha.
That would have been in 86.
Yeah,
early
and
86.
the looking glass was still up, because I remember once we accidentally hailed them, trying to get our plane. Luckily, we had a military rep there who quickly took over and explained what was going on. And sorry, we didn't mean to hail the looking glass when we were trying to do a dry run.
Several of you were looking at reports from SRI
Yeah.
earlier. Do you recall whether any of those included the reconstitution experiments at all? 'Cause I've been trying to nail down the date that first demonstration of reconstitution was done, and I keep thinking it was in '82, certainly before I left ARPA, and, which would have been around October, but I don't have a very clear recollection of that.
Yeah. Don could be able to help me with, along with Jim Massis. I basically took over the reconstitution protocol from Mark Lewis, who had done the first set of demos, and I was involved more in the latter set of demos. So I could check. I might have documentation at home. Look in the garage.
Now, there are two
Be
other
interested in.
Yeah.
There are two other people with BB&N that whose names haven't come up. Radia Perlman was one, and
yeah.
Julie Sussman was the other.
Yeah.
One of the two had some involvement in figuring out what the reconstitution routing protocols had to look like. Was that Radia by any chance?
Oh, boy.
It could have been. It's really hard to
Yeah,
say
'cause
because we had different people working on different things at
Same
different
time.
times. Julie
Yeah.
worked on the early packet radio
Right.
network stuff, and then radio came in a few years later.
Right.
And I'm not sure which people, worked on which things. I mean, there was a group of us, and a lot of us shared
Yeah,
doing different things.
I'm not aware of the early BBN effort in that respect. I only know the SRI contract, and because I was at SRI at that point. And that point, it wasn't like a joint contract like a lot of packet radio was. We were really pretty much working. I think part of the funding was DARPA, and part of it was also out of Rome Labs. And as far as if radio did, I don't know. She had left BBN just prior to my joining. I didn't meet her at a party, but I didn't work with her. And Julie, we overlapped at BBN, and I did talk to her. But again, her involvement in packet radio at that point had wound down a little bit too, because I never dealt with her directly when I was doing the code.
I doubt that it would be Julie who did that work, because the recon protocols were up at the IP layer.
Right.
Whereas
That's correct.
all the other stuff would have been below
Yeah,
at the
so
packet radio level.
So as far as I know, a lot of the key contributions were made by Jim Mathis and Zasing Su, doing the design of how,
Yeah.
realizing you need to split the TCP binding problem between the address and the transport, and how that was causing us grief.
Still a problem today.
Yeah, and in fact, one of the hardest problems for me trying to figure that out was through the IMP. The IMP buffers weren't that long, and I was trying to make the radio realize that, oh, you really changed networks because it broke. Well, I was having trouble whether it was the IMP that was backing up, and I couldn't get it to recognize correctly that it had been moved versus just congestion problems in the net. So I remember having to struggle late one night trying to get ready for a demo, and not having trouble figuring out exactly, what's the right number of things to realize you've dropped before you really have moved. And it was touch and go there for a while, but we made it, which is good.
I mean, I recall in the early days we started to split apart the meetings, and so you would have several days would be a TCP meeting, and then there would be a day that was an IP meeting, and then for a while we were into this awful thing where we throw a gateway meeting in on a Saturday or something like that. But that's sort of how I recall things started to split out, and so you'd have some people covering one set of meetings and other people coming in for other sets, and we started to split out the functionality.
And this is within BBM. then?
Oh, within the whole group, there tended to be people then who started to specialize more on the TCP issues, and I forget, there were a few jokes going around, and maybe Vint remembers some of them, about how could you tell when you were at a TCP meeting versus how could you tell you were at an IP meeting. As I recall, the reason you were at an IP meeting if we were arguing about the length of addresses, and we argued about that for years. And
Well, I think it was basically 1 year. My recollection is all of 1976 was spent arguing over how big should the address space be for IP.
yeah.
And in 1977, I said, finally, okay, we're done. Nobody can come up with any definite conclusion. We're picking 32 bits and we're going to get on with it.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing that people probably don't understand in retrospect is why we were having these arguments and what the parameters were. And so the question was, how many computers are you going to have to address? And people don't realize this was before the personal computer. So like BBN was probably, like SRI and some of the other organizations. I mean, we had a huge number of computers, which was, in the tens maybe. And then when you started talking about network addressing, I distinctly remember sitting there saying, well, it took us 6 months to get the last two connected. So we're going to need 2 to the 16th here. I don't think in my lifetime. And the reason we were arguing about it, the other side of it, was that we had these like 9.6 kilobit lines that we were using to interconnect things. And then you start running telnet protocols over, and people are saying, wait a minute, we're trying to send one character, and we've got how many bytes of addressing with it? And, you know, I mean, now that's not a concern at all, but back then it was a major concern because you were really slowing things down by throwing all this addressing information on top of it. It seems kind of a strange argument these days.
And what was the atmosphere like at BBN in those days?
In what way?
Yeah, it was
Was it
complex.
exciting? Was it-
BBN's always been pretty easygoing, you know, and it was a fairly small group of people. And I think it was exciting across the board in the sense that, you know, we were doing something new that the establishment basically said couldn't be done. I mean, I remember sitting in meetings with representatives from the PTTs and saying, you know, this packet stuff is never going to fly. We know how to do communications. I distinctly remember one meeting in which they said, you can't call what you're doing a gateway because we have defined what a gateway is. And we know, and you don't. And, you know, we were like, so what? I mean, I think there was sort of that sort of atmosphere all the way from the programmers up to people like Vint and Bob, who were saying, you know, no, you can't tell us what we can't do. You know, this was really, it was a technology experiment. And it's like, we're going to see what we can do with the technology, and if it's outside the way people do things now, if it's outside the standards, we don't care. We're going to see what we can do with the technology. And that's really what pushed the whole thing forward.
And Paal, did you have any dealings with, and was the Norwegian PTT involved at all? Not really.
No, they. My boss Ingvar Lund, he was able to persuade them to join, but not as an. He was not able to force them to be an active member. They volunteered to be an observer, but they provided free of charge the uplink to the satellite. They provide 2 lines from Keller to the tandem ground station in Sweden, one 48 kilobit line and another 9.6. And then I think London came up with, you can say, a 9.6 line from UCL to Keller. But we were, and I think that Peter Kirstein had the same problem in England, to really get the PTT involved. They at least in Norway, they were just willing to observe, to see all the stupid things we were doing, but not participate, just comment and observe. And I think when at least my impression was that, say, the standardization bodies and the ARPA community, they were just like dogs and cats. They didn't like each other. They didn't understand anything of, at least the standardization world didn't accept the way the ARPA, say, the communication paradigm. And so they didn't believe in this. That was my problem when I quit NDRE after having spent...
When did you quit?
In August '82. After spending 1.5 years with SRI. Coming back, then I attempted to stay longer, but the big boss at NDRE said, well, at NDRE you have to come back. And when I come back, I was just sitting in my corner. Nobody would very interested in what I have been doing. And then after a few months or a year or so, then I went across the fence to the telecom administration, the research department of the NTA, and they had more money but less interest. So I got money to establish my own, after a short while, establish my own internet, connecting the university in Oslo, Bergen and Trondheim with our facilities at Kjeller, and being able to communicate into the US part of the ARPANET. But
And that, the money came from the Norwegian Telecom.
Yeah.
They did give that.
because they had money enough, so if I was wasting some money on this, it was okay. But it was not possible to get anyone except one person out of 150, 200 employees to participate in the TCP stuff. And that guy, he implemented gateways for the Norwegian part of the internet, making use of the bridge telecom, the bridge communications device. But that was all, and after a while it all died out. They would all use the internet facility, but not participate because they didn't believe in it.
So in '77 at NDRE, they were going along with it, but
Yeah.
not. And what was your official role at that time?
Well, it was to partake in the SatNet development. That was, I mean, the main, at least one major goal, and the other one was to participate in packet speech experiments.
But what was your position within the NDRE? What department were you in? What was
Well, the Department of Electronics,
and your
and just as a research fellow.
But obviously the institution did participate up to the high level, but only as a kind of one.
Well, I think it was permitted. I mean, the group of Ingvalund was permitted to participate. There was no money, and I think the NDRE institution itself was not interested. And I think in the long run, or at least the impression I had was that the technology was at least 10 years ahead of, say, the acceptance. I think that was the same in England, maybe all over the place, but at least in Norway and in Europe, for sure, it was at least 10 years ahead. So when the TCP IP stuff was sort of standardized in '82, it took another 10 years before, and I think that partly due to the web browsers, before it was accepted as the communications mean.
That's, I can confirm that because it was literally just after the internet rollout in January of '83, the U.S. government and DoD included decided that the OSI protocols would be the preferred target. They had 5 years of documentation from 1978 to '83. It was the International Standards Organization had standing as an international standards group. And this other stuff, this TCP/IP stuff, was just a DARPA experiment. So for the ensuing almost exactly 10 years, the U.S. government adopted something called the Government OSI Profile, or GOSSIP, which was published by NIST, our National Institutes of Standards and Technology. And finally, when the Internet Society got started in January of '92, and I served as its first president, not long thereafter I sent a letter to the head of NIST, I forget who that was at the time, suggesting that it was time for them to carry out an evaluation of TCP/IP versus OSI, TP in particular, and to determine whether or not the two were sufficiently equivalent in functionality that it would be acceptable to adopt the use of TCP/IP as an alternative. And they appointed a blue ribbon committee, and after a year of discussion came back saying, yeah, you know, the two are pretty similar. The only difference is we had, by that time, how many years of experience with implementations of TCP, and 0 years of experience with the OSI. So Paul is exactly right, that it took 10 years of fighting to finally overcome that particular challenge.
And I think it's sort of a paradox. The way ITU and the standard bodies are working, they work in periods of 4 years. And at least the communications activity in ISO was very academic. I believe that. And so they were working, say, 4 years to make a standard or standards. And there were like IBM and certainly many other manufacturers participating. And they all got, depending on how strong they were, got their options into the specifications. But then, then it was standardized, and then it should be implemented. And then they had to devise workshops to figure out which of the options should we make use of. So they were spending 1 or 2 or maybe 3 years on selecting the options. And what it turned out was that the options they selected made the ISO, the TP4, the transport protocol, and the lower part equivalent to the TCP IP. I mean, just enormous waste of time.
So just tell a little bit about writing the gateways and traveling, seeing the different sites that were involved in the...
Well, that was really the interesting part of it, and I guess that's why that's what all my memories are around. I mean, it was a very different world in terms of what computing facilities we had and such. We were using paper tapes and we were writing in assembly language and things like that. We'd get the PDP-11 running in the lab, and in many ways, people talk about how much fun it was in that. In many ways, it's a lot like what we do now. I mean, you got a big demonstration coming for DARPA, and we had meetings typically every 3 months, and they went around from, it was BBN, Washington, ISI, SRI, and then thanks to Vint and Bob, we slotted in the European trips so that we always had right before Christmas in London, or it was summer in Norway. They were pretty good at getting those right. But, it was a lot of working late at night. I can still remember Vin hanging over my shoulder. When are we going to get this running? Are we going to get this running? I mean, it was like totally non-obvious. And especially network experiments, there's so many different pieces involved, and all those pieces have to be up at the same time in order for anything to go through. And then you say, oh, finally, we got it. That packet went all the way through. And it's like, yeah, you have any proof? You have any snazzy user interface? The answer's like, no. I mean, network experiments were just like the most boring, uninteresting things, but we're all excited because we got all the pieces working. And, I got to meet people from different parts of the world because we were together every 3 months at meetings, and it was a real young crowd. There were a lot of people who were working fresh out of school, people who, had just come to DARPA, people who had just come into some of the research institutes. So we had a lot of fun together. It was great to be able to go and see people in their home countries, and to spend some time with Paal, to visit in London. So that, that was all really exciting. And those are I think the fond memories we have is much more so than the packets running through the network, is the people we got to know.
Had you been to Europe before that, or
No.
just through work?
No, so it was really
So what
exciting.
was your impression arriving in Oslo and meeting Paal?
It was a great time. I spent time traveling the country. I was very much into the outdoors. I actually made arrangements to go hiking with the sort of the Norwegian National Hiking Association, and back in those days, it wasn't like you jumped on the web and you found out all the information. I mean, this was like multiple phone calls back and forth, and making the transactions to set this up, and then I'm going to meet the group in a Norwegian train station and go hiking for a week. It was like pretty out there, and and then in between, luckily, I had opportunity to stay with Paal, which helped because I didn't know the language or anything. But Norway is just a beautiful country, and I just regret that I haven't gotten back there yet, but it's on my list.
We enjoyed having you there.
So she was this young, almost student age, full of...
Yeah, and Paal was living, I guess, out in what would be the suburbs of Oslo, but more like out in the country. I remember going to the farm next door, and Paal and his wife showed me around and showed me all the barn animals and stuff. It was just like, it was really a lot of fun. I mean, people socialized together a lot more, and really got to know each other as friends as well as co-workers, and that was great.
You were some of the very first people to really use email. I mean, you were among the groups that were the first to use it as a real community tool. I mean, do you feel that, was that different than today, or the ways that you all interacted electronically? And tell us about that.
I think the thing that was different was, the state of communications back then. That was back when you called home and reversed the charges, and somebody kept their eye on the clock because it was dollars per minute for phone calls. International phone calls were even worse. What do you mean you were having problems with the gateway, so you were on the phone to Oslo for an hour? You didn't do that. So yeah, we were some of the first people who benefited from that. I mean, I can remember if you had the network connections up in that, and by that time the ARPANET, for example, was pretty solid. So you had good network connections to California. Well, it was like way easier to type at people, and it was just the Telnet protocols underneath, but that supported being able to type messages at each other. But that was years and years and years before IM. But we were using that as communications because the alternative was picking up the phone, and those phone calls were expensive.
Because...
I'm sorry, there was a time zone issue too. Trying to schedule time zone simultaneous conference calls was hard with, anywhere from 3 to 5 hours of time zone difference or more, 8 hours from the west coast of the U.S. to parts of Europe. So email kind of overcame a lot of those barriers just by allowing you to communicate whenever it was convenient for you.
And I realized that this whole group that had never really come together as a group, and we've got, 20 out of 35, you all, it was by benefit of electronic communications that you were a group. I mean, at the time, you wouldn't have known each other otherwise. So, I mean, how much when you went around and met each other, did you feel that you already had a relationship based on the email and messaging?
Well, we were also in meetings like every 3 months.
I think you're misunderstanding something here. We had face-to-face meetings on a very frequent basis.
In subgroups.
Every 3 months. And so,
but not everybody, or was it?
Well,
there were at least 70 to 100 people who would come to those meetings. So that was a fairly major event.
Okay.
Yes,
Well,
Paul?
I would like to comment on that. In at least my experience in using email nowadays is that if you haven't face-to-face relationship with the people you are corresponding to, an email is it's not binding. I mean, in order to establish a good working relationship, you need person-to-person communications. That has to be established prior to using email. And back in those days, I had two facilities or services I was using. One was the Talk, which enabled me to communicate with my family home every time I was out to these meetings. And another function which I found nice once in a while was the Who Is, You could ask
Yeah.
the computer who is logged on to the computer, and then I could disturb Vint before, for example, or some of the other guy. So that was the my main use in those days.
Do you have any?
I don't think I
Questions
have any other specific questions to ask.
Mhm.
We covered quite a bit of territory
Yeah.
in this discussion. I think it's important to know that the test didn't end with the 1977 three-network demonstration. That was just the first shot, in some sense, of getting multiple nets demonstrated. In fact, looking at some of the reports that Don Nielsen dragged out, it looks like there were 5 or 6 network tests eventually
Yeah,
that
yeah.
were done, including packet radios.
Yeah.
So, of course, and then finally the internet just took off and there were lots and lots of networks. But getting this to work the first time for 3 was a significant milestone in my view. And these 3 folks were part of all that story.
Well, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.